In 1513, a Turkish admiral named Piri Reis created a map that shouldn't exist. The coastline of Antarctica is drawn with impossible accuracy. Mountains, inlets, bays, except Antarctica wouldn't be officially discovered for another 300 years. And the ice that covers those features? It's been there for over 6,000 years. The map shows the land beneath. Cartographers have studied it. Geologists have verified the contours. No one can explain how Race knew what was under the ice. But here's what makes it worse. His map wasn't unique. Dozens of medieval maps contain places that don't exist, alongside places that do. Phantom islands, vanished continents, kingdoms in the clouds. For centuries, sailors searched for lands they'd never find. And on some maps, the impossible places were marked with more certainty than the real ones. This isn't a story about navigation. It's about what humans do when faced with the unknown, and what we're still doing today. If you want more stories that challenge everything you thought you knew about history, subscribe to this channel. We're just getting started. The Carta Marina of 1539 is 9 feet long. It depicts Scandinavia, the Baltic, and the North Atlantic with a level of detail that took decades to compile. Olaus Magnus, the Swedish ecclesiastic who created it, included trade routes, political boundaries, settlements, and shipping lanes. But he also included something else. In the waters off Iceland, there are sea serpents the size of ships, coiled and fanged, devouring sailors. Off the coast of Norway, a creature identified as a sea pig swallows a merchant vessel whole. Near Greenland, there is an island called Friesland, a kingdom with cities, harbors, and detailed topography. Sailors searched for Friesland for 200 years. It doesn't exist. It never did. The Carta Marina wasn't a curiosity. It was used. Navigators consulted it. Merchants planned routes around it. Political leaders made territorial claims based on it. And no one questioned why a map filled with verifiable accuracy also contained complete fabrications. Because that's what maps were. They weren't just records of the world. They were interpretations, explanations, stories told in ink and parchment to make sense of a reality that most people would never see with their own eyes. Consider the scale of the problem. In the 15th century, the vast majority of the world's population never traveled more than 20 miles from where they were born. The ocean was a void. Forests were impenetrable. Mountain ranges were barriers that could take weeks to cross. Almost no one had a complete picture of their own region, let alone distant continents. Yet maps existed, and they claimed to show everything. So what happened when a mapmaker encountered a gap in knowledge? When a coastline trailed off into uncertainty, or rumors of a distant land reached European courts with no way to verify them? The answer is simple. They filled it in. Not with guesses, but with confidence. They drew islands. They sketched kingdoms. They populated empty seas with creatures designed to explain why no one had returned from certain waters. They transformed ignorance into imagery, and those images became reality in the minds of everyone who saw them. This is the first secret of ancient maps, yet they were never neutral. Every line, every label, every illustrated monster carried intent. Maps were tools of belief, shaped by religion, politics, and the fundamental human inability to accept a blank space. To understand what ancient maps actually reveal, you have to stop thinking of them as bad geography. You have to see them for what they were. Windows into the medieval mind, where the boundaries between the known and the imagined blurred until they disappeared entirely. The question we need to answer is simple but profound. How did impossible places become accepted facts? How did fabrications persist for centuries alongside genuine discoveries? And what does that persistence reveal about the way humans construct reality itself? Let's start with the phantom lands. Not the mythical ones, not the allegorical ones, but the islands and continents that were drawn, named, and believed in as completely real for centuries. They influenced exploration. They shaped colonization. They appear on map after map, copied by cartographers who trusted their sources, and their persistence created a feedback loop that made the impossible seem inevitable. The island of Brazil appears on maps beginning in 1325. It's located off the west coast of Ireland, sometimes circular, sometimes crescent-shaped, occasionally splitting into two separate islands. The name has nothing to do with the South American country. It derives from the Irish Hy-Brasil, meaning clan of Brasil, though some scholars link it to Bras, an old word for blessed. For over 500 years, Brazil was treated as fact. Expeditions were launched to find it. In 1480, a ship sailed from Bristol specifically to locate the island. It failed. Another tried in 1481, another in 1497. None succeeded. Yet the island remained on maps until 1865. Why did it last so long? Because sailors kept reporting it. Sightings were recorded. Logbooks described it. In 1674, a Captain John Nisbet claimed he had landed there, spent an entire day on its shores, and spoke with an old man who lived in a stone castle. He described the island's geography in detail: rolling green hills, a central tower, grazing cattle. His account was published. It was discussed in maritime circles. It reinforced the island's existence for another generation. This is how phantom lands worked. One ambiguous sighting, perhaps a fog bank, a low cloud formation, a trick of light on the water, gets recorded. The record gets copied. The copy gets trusted. And other sailors, primed by the expectation, interpret their own ambiguous experiences as confirmation. The island appears on another map. More expeditions are launched. And each failure is rationalized. The weather was wrong. The latitude was slightly off. The currents shifted. The island itself, some claimed, moved. But Brazil wasn't alone. The Atlantic was littered with phantom islands, each with its own history of failed searches and persistent belief. Sandy Island appeared on maps of the Pacific between Australia and New Caledonia from the late 18th century onward. It was marked on official navigational charts. Ships were warned to avoid its shallow waters. In 2012, a research vessel sailed to its coordinates. They found nothing but open ocean over 1,000 meters deep. The island was finally removed from charts. It had existed on maps for over 200 years, based on a single unverified report from a whaling ship in 1876. Then there's Antillia, the island of the seven cities. According to legend, 7 Catholic bishops fled the Iberian Peninsula during the Moorish invasion of the 8th century, sailed west across the Atlantic, and founded 7 cities on a distant island. The story was old, passed down through oral tradition for centuries. But in the 15th century, it appeared on maps. Martin Behaim's globe of 1492, the oldest surviving terrestrial globe, places Antillia directly in the Atlantic, roughly where the Azores actually are, but much larger. The island is rectangular, with the 7 cities labeled and evenly distributed. Christopher Columbus knew about Antillia. He referenced it in his notes. Some historians argue he believed he might find it on his westward voyage. When he encountered the Caribbean islands, there was momentary confusion about whether he'd reached Antillia or something else entirely. The name eventually transferred. Antilles became the term for the island chain he did find. But on maps, the original Antillia persisted, drifting westward as the real geography of the Americas was filled in, until it quietly vanished in the late 16th century. The island wasn't just a navigational error. It represented hope, a Christian sanctuary in the unknown West, a place where faith had survived against overwhelming odds. The story resonated because it offered meaning to the void. If Antillia existed, then the Atlantic wasn't just empty water. It was a space where miracles were possible. It's where the righteous could find refuge. The island existed on maps because people needed it to exist, and that need was powerful enough to override evidence, or the lack thereof, for generations. St. Brendan's Isle is another. Named after the 6th century Irish monk who, according to legend, sailed the Atlantic in search of the Isle of the Blessed, the island appears on maps from the 10th century onward. It's placed in various locations, west of Ireland, near the Canary Islands, sometimes in the mid-Atlantic. Expeditions were mounted. In 1526, a Portuguese expedition searched for it. In 1721, a Jesuit priest claimed to have seen it off the coast of Tenerife. Reports continued into the 19th century. Even as the Atlantic was fully charted and every island catalogued, sailors insisted they had glimpsed it, always on the horizon, always unreachable. The legend of St. Brendan's voyage was detailed and vivid. He and his monks supposedly encountered crystal pillars, icebergs likely, encountered a whale they mistook for an island, found a land of giant sheep, and eventually reached a paradise island shrouded in mist. The account, known as the Navigatio Sancti Brendani Abbadis, was one of the most widely read texts of the medieval period. It blended genuine navigational observations with miraculous events, making it impossible to separate fact from religious allegory. But that ambiguity worked in the island's favor. If parts of the account were true, why not all of it? And if St. Brendan had found the island once, it must still be there, waiting. These aren't isolated errors. They're systematic. The island of Hy-Brasil appears on maps by Angelino Dulcert in 1325 and persists through the 17th century. The phantom island of Freyland, invented or misidentified in the 14th century, appears on maps by Mercator and Ortelius, two of the most respected cartographers of the Renaissance. The island of Satanazes appears on multiple 15th century maps, always ominous, always labeled as cursed or dangerous, though no one could say why. These islands weren't footnotes. They were prominent features, drawn with the same care and detail as verified landmasses. And when expeditions failed to find them, the solution wasn't to remove them from maps. It was to question the expedition. The Pacific tells the same story. Pepys Island was allegedly discovered by English explorer Ambrose Cowley in 1684 north of the Falklands. And for over a century, British charts included it. Multiple expeditions searched. All failed. It was finally removed in the 19th century. The Aurora Islands, supposedly sighted by the Spanish ship Aurora in 1762, appeared on charts until 1856. Davis Land, reported in 1687, was thought to be part of Easter Island, but maps placed it separately, creating a phantom landmass that persisted until the early 19th century. The Spanish explorer Juan Fernandez reported discovering islands rich in gold and silver in the Pacific in the late 16th century. Maps dutifully included them. They were never found. What's critical to understand is the feedback mechanism. Mapmakers didn't invent these places from nothing. They copied them from earlier maps, which had copied them from earlier sources, which had drawn them based on verbal reports, or rumors, or misidentified landmasses. The repetition created authority. If 5 maps show an island, the 6th mapmaker assumes it's real. If 10 maps show it, it becomes fact. The burden of proof inverts. Instead of needing evidence that the island exists, you'd need evidence that it doesn't. And how do you prove the absence of something in an ocean no one has fully explored? Each failed expedition could be explained away. Navigation was imprecise. Latitude was easier to determine than longitude, which remained unsolved until the 18th century. Currents could shift a ship's position without the crew realizing it. Storms could obscure landmarks. And then there was the possibility that the island itself had sunk, been destroyed by volcanic activity, or, in more fantastical explanations, disappeared through supernatural means. The inability to find something wasn't proof it didn't exist. It was just another challenge to overcome. Repetition makes fiction feel real. The human mind craves confirmation. When a story is told often enough, with enough consistency, it stops being questioned. And in the medieval world, where information traveled slowly, where sources were scarce, where the stakes of navigation were life and death, maps became truth simply by existing. But phantom islands are only the beginning. They're the rational errors, the understandable mistakes born from confusion and rumor. What about the places that were never meant to be real? The lands drawn not from misidentification, but from pure mythology, theology, and cosmology. These are the places where maps stopped being tools of navigation and became documents of belief. The Garden of Eden appears on maps. Not as allegory, as geography. The Hereford Mappa Mundi, created around 1300, is a massive medieval map centered on Jerusalem. At the top, in the Far East, is Paradise. It's depicted as a circular island, surrounded by a wall of fire, containing the Tree of Life and the 4 rivers of Genesis, Pishon, Gihon, Tigris, and Euphrates. This wasn't symbolic. Medieval theologians debated the precise location of Eden. Some placed it in Mesopotamia, others in Ethiopia. Some argued it was elevated, physically higher than the rest of the earth, which explained why Noah's flood didn't reach it. The Hereford map reflects this literal interpretation. Eden is a place you could, theoretically, travel to, if you could cross the impassable mountains and survive the flames. The same map includes the terrestrial paradise, marked the land of the Hyperboreans, a mythical people from Greek tradition who lived in eternal spring beyond the north wind, and the territories of Gog and Magog, the apocalyptic nations mentioned in the Book of Revelation. According to medieval legend, Alexander the Great had built massive gates to imprison Gog and Magog in the far north, preventing them from invading the civilized world until the end times. The Hereford map shows these gates. They're labeled. They're positioned geographically. If you were planning a journey to the far reaches of Asia, the map told you what to expect. A literal barrier holding back the forces of apocalypse. These weren't decorative. They were integrated into the map's geography as real locations with real implications. If Gog and Magog were imprisoned behind Alexander's gates in the far north, or as the legend claimed, then travelers heading in that direction needed to be warned. The map served a moral and theological function. It organized the world according to Christian cosmology, where geography and scripture were inseparable. The physical world and the spiritual world occupied the same space. A journey across the map was simultaneously a journey through biblical history and prophecy. Sea monsters fill the oceans on medieval maps, but they're not random. Each creature serves a purpose. The giant squid or kraken represents the danger of deep water, the unpredictability of the ocean's depths. The sea serpent, coiled and massive, marks areas where ships have disappeared, a visual shorthand for hazardous waters. Some creatures are didactic. The whale that resembles an island, yet tricking sailors into landing on its back before it dives and drowns them, is a direct reference to the biblical story of Jonah and a medieval allegory for the devil's deception. The Aspidoccoloni, as it was called, appears on map after map, always accompanied by a warning. These images communicated risk, morality, and theology simultaneously. A sailor consulting a map didn't just see a monster. They saw a warning encoded in their worldview. The creatures also reflected classical sources. Pliny, the Elder's Natural History, written in the 1st century, cataloged monstrous races living at the edges of the known world. The Cyopods, humans with a single large foot they used as a sunshade. The Blemmies, headless people with faces on their chests. The Cynocephali, dog-headed men. And medieval maps incorporated these races as real populations living in distant lands. The Hereford map places them in Africa and Asia, labeled and illustrated. These weren't considered myth. They were natural history, as credible as any other report from distant lands. If Pliny wrote it, and if travelers occasionally returned with stories that seemed to confirm it, then it belonged on the map. Then there are the edges. Medieval maps frequently depict the world as finite, with clear boundaries. The edge of the world in many cosmologies was a literal drop-off, a place where the ocean poured into an abyss. Some maps show a surrounding ocean, the Mare Oceanum, encircling all known lands. Beyond it, nothing. Or worse than nothing, chaos. The formless void that existed before creation. This wasn't ignorance. It was a deliberate theological statement. The world was bounded because God had bounded it. To venture beyond was not just physically dangerous but spiritually transgressive. You would be leaving the ordained order of creation and entering a space where God's laws no longer applied. The Ebstorf map, created in the 13th century, takes this further. It's a massive mappa mundi, over 12 feet across, destroyed during World War II but preserved in detailed reproductions. The map depicts the world as the body of Christ. His head is at the top, in the east, where paradise is located. His hands extend to the north and south. His feet are at the bottom, in the west. The entire world is contained within the divine form. Geography is incarnation. To travel across the map is to move through sacred space, in every location imbued with theological significance. Jerusalem at the center is positioned at Christ's navel, the spiritual center of the cosmos. These maps weren't meant to guide sailors across oceans. They were meant to guide souls through life. The geography they depicted was as much moral as physical. The placement of paradise, the location of monstrous races, the depiction of hell at the edges, these were lessons about the structure of reality. The world was organized according to divine plan. The map made that plan visible, and the impossible places on it were essential to that visibility. They showed where God's order ended and chaos began. They showed where humanity belonged and where it didn't. They were boundaries drawn in theology, not longitude and latitude. Prester John's kingdom is one of the most persistent mythical geographies. Beginning in the 12th century, letters circulated in Europe claiming to be from a Christian king ruling a vast and wealthy empire somewhere in the east. Prester John was said to command armies, possess miraculous relics, and govern a land of plenty where rivers ran with gold and gemstones littered the ground. European leaders desperately wanted to believe in him. A Christian ally in the East could turn the tide against Islamic expansion. It could open trade routes. It could provide military support during the Crusades. Expeditions were sent to find him. Maps placed his kingdom in Central Asia, then later in Ethiopia, when the Asian searches failed. For over 400 years, explorers searched. On Portuguese expeditions to Ethiopia in the 15th and 16th centuries were partially motivated by the search for Prester John. They found Christian kingdoms. Ethiopia had been Christian since the 4th century, but not the empire of legend. The rivers didn't run with gold. The king didn't possess the miraculous fountain of youth or command armies capable of conquering the Islamic world. Yet the legend persisted. Even after Ethiopia was contacted and its actual geography documented, maps continued to label regions as Prester John's land. The need for the kingdom to exist outweighed the evidence that it didn't. Maps reflected belief systems, not just data. They were shaped by the worldview of the people who made them. So, medieval Christian map organized the world around Jerusalem because Jerusalem was the spiritual center of existence. An Islamic map from the same period centered on Mecca. A Buddhist map placed Mount Meru, the cosmic mountain, at the center of the world. The accuracy of coastlines mattered less than the moral and cosmological order the map conveyed. Geography was theology made visible. But maps weren't just theological. They were political. And this is where the impossible places become tools of power. If you're starting to see how deep this goes, hit subscribe. Because what comes next reveals how maps became weapons. In 1529, the Treaty of Zaragoza attempted to divide the world between Spain and Portugal. The treaty drew a line through the Pacific, granting each empire exclusive rights to territories on their respective sides. On the problem? No one knew what was on either side. The Pacific had barely been explored. Islands were rumors. Entire coastlines were guesswork. Yet the treaty was signed, and maps were drawn reflecting the division. Lands that didn't exist were claimed. Borders were established in oceans no European had fully crossed. The map became the justification for conquest before the conquest even occurred. This wasn't unique. European empires routinely exaggerated the size of their territories on maps. A kingdom's borders would be drawn to include lands that were contested, unconquered, or entirely imaginary. The mapmaker's pen transformed ambition into legitimacy. If a map showed a region as belonging to Spain, then Spain could claim it was already theirs, even if they'd never set foot there. Maps were propaganda, and the impossible places on them were often the most politically useful. Consider the mountains of Kong. European maps of Africa in the 18th and 19th centuries depict a massive mountain range stretching across West Africa, running parallel to the coast for thousands of miles. Villages are labeled. Rivers originate in these mountains. Trade routes supposedly cross them. Expeditions were planned around them. The range appears on maps by some of the most respected cartographers of the era. Except they don't exist. They never did. The mountains were invented, likely based on a misinterpretation of a traveler's report, and then copied from map to map for over a century. The original error may have come from Mungo Park, a Scottish explorer who traveled through West Africa in the 1790s. He reported hearing about mountains from local informants, but the details were vague and possibly lost in translation. Cartographers, eager to fill in the blank spaces of African geography, extrapolated from his report and drew a range that spanned the continent. Other mapmakers copied it. The mountains gained detail with each iteration: peaks, passes, rivers. They became real through repetition. They weren't removed until the early 20th century, after multiple expeditions confirmed their absence. But during the time they existed, they influenced colonial policy, trade routes, and territorial claims. The French planned expeditions to cross them. The British used them to justify borders. An imaginary mountain range shaped real political decisions for over 100 years. And when they were finally removed, it wasn't because of a single expedition disproving them. It was because so many expeditions had searched and found nothing that the cumulative weight of negative evidence became undeniable. The same is true for California. On many early 17th century maps, California is depicted as an island, separated from the North American continent by a wide channel. This wasn't a minor error. It persisted for over 100 years, appearing on maps by Coronelli, Sanson, and other prominent cartographers. Spanish explorers had traveled the Pacific coast. Hernán Cortés had sailed the Gulf of California in the 1530s and 1540s. They knew California was a peninsula, yet the island version kept reappearing. Why? Because it was politically useful. If California was an island, it could be claimed separately from the mainland. It could be controlled, or defended and exploited independently. It created a strategic advantage, an isolated territory, easier to govern, harder for rivals to invade. The map served the empire's interests, even when it contradicted observable reality. Spanish authorities repeatedly issued corrections, stating that California was not an island. In 1747, King Ferdinand VI of Spain officially decreed that California was a peninsula and ordered all maps to reflect this. Yet the island version continued to appear on maps published in other countries for decades afterward. Belief, once established, resists correction. The Strait of Anian is another political phantom. Renaissance maps frequently show a waterway cutting through North America, connecting the Atlantic and Pacific. The Northwest Passage was a dream of European explorers for centuries, a shortcut to Asia, or a route that would revolutionize trade. The Strait of Anian, as it was called, appears on maps by Zaltieri in 1566, Ortelius in 1570, and Mercator in 1569. It's drawn with confidence, as if verified, even though no European had ever sailed it. The strait was based on a combination of wishful thinking and misinterpreted reports. Spanish explorers in the Pacific had heard rumors from indigenous populations about waterways to the north. These reports were fragmentary, filtered through translation, and often referred to rivers or narrow channels, not transcontinental passages. But European cartographers, eager to solve the problem of the Northwest Passage, interpreted these rumors as confirmation. The strait appeared on maps because empires needed it to exist. Whoever controlled it would dominate global trade. The Phantom Strait influenced exploration for 2 centuries, driving expeditions into the Arctic that ended in starvation, shipwreck, and death. Terra Australis Incognita, the unknown southern land, is perhaps the most ambitious political phantom. Based on the classical theory that the Earth needed a large landmass in the southern hemisphere to balance the continents in the north, cartographers began drawing a massive southern continent long before anyone had seen it. Ptolemy's geography suggested it. Medieval maps elaborated on it. By the Renaissance, Terra Australis was a fixture on world maps, often depicted as larger than Asia, stretching across the entire bottom of the globe. The continent was purely theoretical. No evidence supported it beyond the desire for symmetry. But that didn't stop it from influencing exploration. Our Dutch explorers in the 17th century encountered the northern coast of Australia and believed they'd found the edge of Terra Australis. Captain Cook's voyages in the 18th century were partially motivated by the search for the Great Southern Continent. He sailed farther south than anyone before him, finding nothing but ocean and ice. He effectively disproved the existence of Terra Australis as imagined, a temperate, inhabited landmass. But the idea persisted. Even after Antarctica was discovered in the 19th century, some geographers argued it might be the remnant of the legendary continent, shrunk and frozen but still there. Political maps also contained internal, impossible places. Borders were drawn through territories no European had explored, dividing lands among empires that had never controlled them. On the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, which divided Africa among European powers, was conducted using maps that were wildly inaccurate. Rivers were misplaced, mountain ranges were invented. Entire regions were labeled with names that referred to multiple different areas, creating confusion that persists today. The borders drawn at that conference, straight lines cutting through ethnic territories, watersheds, and trade routes, ignored the reality on the ground. The map was the authority. The people living there, who knew the geography intimately, were not consulted. Maps were tools of power. They didn't just reflect political ambitions. They enabled them. A line on a map became a justification for conquest. A labeled territory became a claim of ownership. The impossible places on these maps, the exaggerated mountains, the phantom straits, the inflated empires, weren't errors. They were strategies. They made ambition look like fact. And because maps carried the authority of knowledge, they were difficult to challenge. How do you argue against a map? Especially when the people with the power to correct the map are the same people who benefit from its inaccuracies? But here's where the story complicates. If ancient maps were filled with fabrications, mistakes, and propaganda, why do some of them contain accurate information that shouldn't be possible? This is where the impossible places become truly disturbing. Because the presence of phantom islands and mythical kingdoms is one thing, but the presence of accurate geography in places that should be unknown, that suggests something else entirely. The Piri Reis map mentioned at the beginning is the most famous example. Created in 1513, it shows the eastern coast of South America with remarkable accuracy. It also shows Antarctica, or what appears to be Antarctica, centuries before the continent was officially discovered in 1820. Geologists have compared the map's depiction of the Antarctic coastline to modern seismic data of the land beneath the ice. The resemblance is striking. The map shows bays, inlets, and coastal features that match the subglacial topography. Features that have been hidden under miles of ice for thousands of years. The mainstream explanation is that Piri Reis compiled his map from older sources, some of which may have been based on even older maps. He notes in his annotations that he used about 20 charts and mappae mundi, including maps from the time of Alexander the Great and one drawn by Christopher Columbus. He also claims to have used a map captured from a Spanish sailor who had sailed with Columbus. The implication is that ancient knowledge, passed down through generations, somehow preserved accurate coastal data from a time before the ice. Or, alternatively, that the Antarctic coastline on the map is a misidentification, perhaps the coast of South America, distorted and misplaced. But this raises more questions than it answers. If the coastline is South America, why does it match Antarctic subglacial features? If it's Antarctica, how did anyone map it before the ice? Piri Reis himself couldn't have visited Antarctica. The technology didn't exist. So where did the information come from? The map's annotations mention ancient sources, but those sources are lost. We're left with a document that appears to show impossible knowledge, and with no clear explanation for how that knowledge was obtained. The Orontius Phineas map of 1531 shows Antarctica again, this time in the center of the map, with rivers, mountains, and a detailed interior. The continent is ice-free. Modern analysis of subglacial topography shows similarities to the map's depiction. The Ross Sea, the Weddell Sea, and other features appear to correspond, at least loosely, to the map's geography. Again, the question, how? Phineas was a French mathematician and cartographer working in the Renaissance. He had no way to survey Antarctica. He claimed his map was based on older sources, but he doesn't name them. Like Piri Reis, He seems to be copying from a tradition of cartography that preserves information from an unknown origin. One possibility is cumulative knowledge. Ancient civilizations, particularly seafaring ones, may have possessed far more sophisticated navigation and cartographic skills than the historical record suggests. Knowledge doesn't always leave written traces. Oral traditions, apprenticeships, and closely guarded trade secrets can transmit information across generations without formal documentation. Polynesian navigators crossed the Pacific using mental maps and stellar navigation techniques that European explorers couldn't replicate. Their knowledge was encoded in chants, stick charts, and methods passed down through lineages. It's possible that similar systems existed in other cultures, preserving geographic data that seems impossible by the standards of written records. The Phoenicians were master navigators. They circumnavigated Africa in the 6th century BCE, according to Herodotus. They established trade routes across the Mediterranean and possibly into the Atlantic. Some historians speculate they reached the Americas, though evidence is scant. If they did possess extensive geographic knowledge, where did it go? The Phoenician civilization was absorbed by Rome. Their libraries were destroyed. Their maps, if they existed, were lost. But pieces of their knowledge may have survived, copied into later maps, fragments of a once comprehensive geographic understanding. The Portolan charts are another example of seemingly impossible accuracy. These are highly accurate nautical maps from the 13th and 14th centuries, primarily of the Mediterranean and Black Sea. They show coastlines, ports, and navigational routes with a precision that rivals modern maps. Where the compass roses and rhumb lines, navigational grids, are mathematically sophisticated. Yet they appeared suddenly with no clear developmental history. Historians debate their origin. Some argue they were based on Roman or even earlier sources. Others suggest they were the product of medieval mariners' empirical observations, refined over generations through trial and error. Either way, the Portolans demonstrate that pre-modern cartography could achieve remarkable accuracy when it prioritized function over cosmology. But Portolans only cover known waters. They don't explain how Antarctic coastlines appear on Renaissance maps. They don't explain the accuracy of certain Asian and African features on medieval maps created by cultures that shouldn't have had access to that information. The Hereford Mappa Mundi, art for all its theological content, accurately depicts the source of the Nile, a geographic mystery that Europeans wouldn't solve until the 19th century. The map places it in mountains south of the equator, which is correct. How did a 13th century monk in England know that? The answer might be trade. Information traveled along trade routes. Merchants, sailors, and pilgrims carried knowledge between cultures. Arabic geographers in the medieval period had access to Greek, Persian, and Indian sources. They compiled this knowledge into sophisticated maps that European cartographers later copied. The transmission of information was slow, fragmented, and often distorted, but it happened. A Chinese map might influence an Arabic map, which might be copied by an Italian merchant, now which might be referenced by a German monk creating a Mappa Mundi. The result is a patchwork of accurate and inaccurate information, blended together in ways that obscure the original sources. But this still doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain why some maps show features that no known civilization had the capability to survey. It doesn't explain the recurring appearance of Antarctica on pre-discovery maps. It doesn't explain the precision of certain coastlines in regions that were, according to all available records, unexplored. We're left with gaps, and those gaps create space for speculation. Some argue for lost civilizations with advanced cartographic technology. Others suggest that the accuracy is coincidental, a result of lucky guesses and pattern-seeking in ambiguous data. Still others believe the maps are evidence of knowledge transfer from sources we haven't identified, explorers who left no written record, oral traditions that preserved geographic information for millennia. What's certain is this: ancient maps contain a mixture of fact and fiction that we still don't fully understand. The impossible places, the phantom islands, the mythical kingdoms, are easy to dismiss. But the accurate places, the ones that shouldn't be accurate, are harder to explain. They suggest that the history of human exploration is more complex than the linear narrative we've constructed. They suggest that knowledge was gained, lost, and partially recovered in cycles we can't fully trace. And they suggest that the maps we trust today might contain their own gaps, places where we think we know, but don't. So why the coexistence? Why do maps like the Carta Marina contain both precise coastlines and complete fabrications? Why does the Piri Reis map show accurate South American geography alongside impossible Antarctic features? The answer lies in the purpose of the map. A portolan chart was a working tool for sailors. It needed to be accurate because lives depended on it. A captain navigating the Mediterranean couldn't afford errors. His map had to reflect reality as closely as possible. So portolans were empirical, updated constantly, and focused on practical navigation. They contained no sea monsters, no theological content, no mythical islands, just coastlines, ports, and compass lines. A world map, a mappa mundi, served a different function. It was educational, theological, political. Accuracy mattered less than comprehensiveness. And the mapmaker's goal was to show everything, the known, the rumored, the believed, and the imagined, in a single image. The impossible places weren't errors to be avoided. They were essential parts of the worldview the map was meant to convey. A mappa mundi without paradise, without Gog and Magog, without monstrous races, would be incomplete. It wouldn't fulfill its purpose. The map wasn't just showing where things were. It was showing what they meant. Maps as psychology. Humans cannot tolerate blank spaces. The unknown is intolerable. It creates anxiety, fear, and a compulsion to fill the void. When faced with uncertainty, the human mind generates explanations. It creates stories, assigns meaning, and imposes order, even if that order is fictional. Ancient maps are physical manifestations of this impulse. In there, the medieval mind's refusal to accept, "I don't know." Consider the phrase, "here be dragons." It's become synonymous with ancient maps, though it only appears on one known globe, the Hunt Lennox globe from around 1510, in Latin, Hic sunt dracones. But the concept is everywhere. Uncharted waters are filled with monsters. Unexplored lands are marked as dangerous, cursed, or inhabited by monstrous races. The unknown is always threatening, always hostile. Why? Because the alternative is worse. A blank space on a map is an admission of ignorance. It's a void that the mind can't process. Fear of the unknown is primal, rooted in survival. Early humans who feared the dark, who avoided unfamiliar territory, who assumed danger in the unseen, were more likely to survive than those who wandered blindly into threats. That instinct doesn't disappear just because we create maps. It redirects. The ocean becomes a dragon. The distant land becomes a kingdom of cannibals. The void is filled with threats because a known threat is easier to process than pure uncertainty. The mind can prepare for a dragon. It can't prepare for nothing. But there's another psychological layer. The impossible places also represent hope. The island of Brazil, Antillia, Prester John's kingdom, these weren't just warnings. They were destinations, places of refuge, wealth, and wonder. They existed in the collective imagination because people needed them to exist. The world was brutal, unpredictable, and often hopeless. Disease, war, famine, these were constants. But somewhere beyond the horizon, there might be a blessed land, a kingdom of gold, a place where life was better. The impossible places on maps weren't just products of fear. They were products of longing. This duality, fear and hope encoded in geography, persisted because it served a function. It motivated exploration. It justified risk. Sailors endured unimaginable hardship because the maps promised something worth finding. Even if that something was imaginary, the promise was enough. And occasionally, the explorers found something real. Not the island they were searching for, but a new land, a new route, a new truth. The island of Brazil led sailors to explore the western Atlantic, which eventually led to the discovery of the Americas. Prester John's kingdom motivated Portuguese exploration of Africa, which opened trade routes and expanded geographic knowledge. The impossible places led to real discoveries, even though the places themselves never existed. The psychology of the blank space explains why phantom islands persisted even after failed searches. Each expedition that returned empty-handed could be rationalized. The island was missed, the coordinates were wrong, the weather obscured it. But removing the island from the map? That required admitting defeat. Admitting that the explorers had wasted time, resources, and lives searching for nothing. It was easier to keep the island on the map and plan another expedition than to accept the failure. The map became a repository of hope and denial in equal measure. Now consider the modern equivalent. Today's maps are digital, satellite verified, and updated in real time. There are no phantom islands, no sea monsters. The entire surface of the Earth has been photographed, cataloged, and rendered in high resolution. Google Maps can show you a street view of almost anywhere. GPS can pinpoint your location to within meters. The unknown has been eliminated. Or has it? We still map the unknown with assumptions. Look at maps of the ocean floor. The deep sea is less explored than the surface of Mars. Vast regions are marked with estimated topography based on gravitational readings and sonar. The details are guesswork, interpolated from limited data. Yet the maps show them with confidence, color-coded and contoured as if verified. We fill the void with data because blank spaces are unacceptable. The assumption is that the interpolation is close enough that the model reflects reality. But it's still a model. It's still an interpretation imposed on an unknown space. Look at maps of the human brain. Neuroscientists create intricate diagrams of neural networks, labeling regions with specific functions: emotion, memory, language, decision-making. These maps are useful. They guide research. They help diagnose disorders. But they're also simplifications, interpretations, models. The brain doesn't actually have hard borders between the part that does emotion and the part that does logic. Neural activity is distributed, overlapping, and context-dependent. The map imposes structure on something far more complex. It makes the unknowable seem knowable, and in doing so, it shapes how we think about consciousness, identity, and what it means to be human. The map isn't neutral. It's a tool that reflects our current understanding and our current limitations. Or consider maps of the future: climate models, economic projections, our pandemic forecasts. These are maps in the temporal sense. They chart what we believe will happen based on current data. They're filled with the equivalent of phantom islands, predicted outcomes that never materialize, imagined scenarios that shift with every update. A climate model might predict a specific temperature rise by 2050. That prediction influences policy, infrastructure investment, and international agreements. But the model is based on assumptions about emissions, about feedback loops, about human behavior. If any of those assumptions are wrong, the prediction is wrong. Yet we treat it as fact because the alternative, not knowing what the future holds, is intolerable. Economic models predict growth, recession, inflation. Governments base budgets on these predictions. Investors allocate trillions of dollars based on them. But the models failed to predict the 2008 financial crisis. They failed to predict the economic impact of the COVID-19 pandemic. They're wrong regularly, sometimes catastrophically. Yet we continue to create them, refine them, and base decisions on them. Because a flawed map is better than no map, the need to impose order on uncertainty overrides the acknowledgement that the order might be illusory. Pandemic models showed projected infection rates, death tolls, and healthcare capacity. These maps shaped public policy, lockdown decisions, and resource allocation. Some predictions were accurate, others were wildly off. But in the moment, the maps were treated as authoritative. They had to be. Decision-makers needed something to guide them. The alternative, admitting that the future was unknowable, would have paralyzed response efforts. So we filled the blank spaces of the future with models, knowing they might be wrong, but unable to function without them. The impulse hasn't changed. We're still filling blank spaces. We're still drawing dragons in the deep. We're still creating maps that blend observation, belief, and speculation because that's what maps do. They don't just reflect reality, they organize it. They make the incomprehensible manageable. And in doing so, they reveal more about the map maker than the territory. Ancient maps weren't primitive. They were honest about uncertainty. A medieval map maker who drew a sea monster in uncharted waters was acknowledging the limits of their knowledge. They were saying, I don't know what's there, but it's dangerous. Modern maps, with their clean lines and confident projections, obscure uncertainty. They present the unknown as known, the speculative as factual. We've traded visible dragons for invisible assumptions. And those assumptions might be more dangerous because we don't recognize them as assumptions. We see them as facts. And those assumptions shape behavior just as powerfully as the monsters on medieval maps. A climate model predicting catastrophe influences policy, even if the model is based on incomplete data. An economic forecast showing growth justifies investment, even if the forecast is extrapolated from trends that might not hold. A pandemic map showing infection spread alters human behavior, even if the map's underlying data is partial or flawed. The maps guide us. We trust them. And when they're wrong, we adjust the map and continue forward, because moving without a map is unthinkable. But here's the disturbing part. The impossible places on ancient maps were eventually disproven. Explorers searched for the island of Brazil and found nothing. Expeditions looked for the mountains of Kong and reported their absence. The maps were corrected. The phantom lands were removed. The process was slow, sometimes taking centuries, but it happened. Reality imposed itself on imagination. The world was fully explored. The blank spaces were filled with verified geography. The impossible places vanished from maps because they couldn't survive contact with reality. What if we've created impossible places that can't be disproven? What if the maps we're drawing now, of climate, of the economy, of geopolitics, of human nature itself, contain phantom lands that we'll never be able to verify or refute because they exist in systems too complex, yet too chaotic, too dependent on human belief to ever be conclusively mapped? What if the map has become the territory, and we're navigating by fictions we've mistaken for facts, just as medieval sailors searched for islands that only existed in ink? Climate models predict outcomes decades or centuries in the future. How do we verify them? By waiting. But by the time we know if the model was accurate, the decisions based on it have already been made. The map shaped reality. If the model predicted catastrophe and policy prevented it, was the model accurate or self-negating? If the model predicted growth and policy enabled it, was the model predictive or prescriptive? The line between map and territory blurs. The model doesn't just describe the future, it creates it. Economic models do the same. A prediction of recession can cause recession if enough people believe it and act accordingly. A prediction of growth can create growth through the same mechanism. The map influences the territory it's supposed to represent. This is fundamentally different from ancient cartography. A map showing the island of Brazil couldn't make the island real. A map showing the mountains of Kong couldn't raise mountains from the earth. But a map showing future economic collapse can make that collapse more likely. A map showing social unrest can provoke the unrest it predicts. The modern impossible places aren't static, they're dynamic. They interact with reality in ways that make verification impossible. And this brings us to the most unsettling implication. What if we're living on a map filled with phantom islands we've collectively agreed to believe in? What if the certainties we navigate by, economic theories, political ideologies, social assumptions, are the modern equivalent of Antillia and Prester John's kingdom? Places that don't exist, but that we've drawn with such confidence, copied so many times that they've become indistinguishable from reality. The ancient cartographers knew their maps were incomplete. They acknowledged the monsters. They labeled the unknown. They drew Paradise and Gog and Magog because those places were part of their worldview, and the map was meant to reflect that worldview. There was an honesty in that, a recognition that the map was an interpretation, not the thing itself. We don't do that anymore. We pretend we've charted everything. We act as if the map is complete. We trust our models with the certainty that medieval scholars trusted Ptolemy. And when the models fail, When the predictions don't match reality, we adjust the model and move forward. We don't question the underlying assumption that reality can be mapped at all. We don't consider the possibility that some things, complex systems, human behavior, the future itself, might be inherently unmappable. That the act of creating the map changes what's being mapped. That the dragons we've hidden in invisible assumptions are more dangerous than the ones drawn on parchment because we don't see them until it's too late. The strangest places on ancient maps weren't mistakes. They were the human mind trying to make sense of a world it didn't yet understand. And we're still doing it. We've just gotten better at hiding the dragons. We've buried them in statistical models, economic forecasts, and climate projections. We've replaced sea monsters with confidence intervals and error bars, but the impulse is the same. The need to fill the blank spaces, the inability to accept uncertainty, the compulsion to draw a map, any map, rather than admit we don't know. And maybe that's the real lesson. Maybe the impossible places on ancient maps weren't failures of cartography. Maybe they were attempts to represent something true. The limits of knowledge, the presence of fear, the persistence of hope. Maybe by removing the dragons and the phantom islands, by creating maps that pretend to show everything with certainty, we've lost something important. We've lost the acknowledgement that we're navigating by belief as much as by fact. That every map is a story we tell ourselves about the world. And that the most dangerous stories are the ones we mistake for truth. The ancient cartographers drew paradise at the edge of the world. We've drawn it in the future, a perfect climate model, a stable economy, a peaceful globe. And we're navigating toward it with the same faith that sailors had when they searched for the island of Brazil. The difference is, they knew they might never find it. We've convinced ourselves it's already on the map. So here's the question. What are we mapping wrong today? What modern certainties are phantom islands? What assumptions have we copied from map to map until they became indistinguishable from reality? And what happens when we finally sail to those coordinates and find nothing but open water? Which the impossible places on ancient maps reveal something profound about human nature. We are creatures who cannot abide the unknown. We will fill every blank space, answer every question, and impose order on chaos even when that order is fictional. The maps are mirrors. They show us not the world as it is, but the world as we need it to be. And that need, to know, to understand, to control, is both our greatest strength and our deepest vulnerability. Share your theories in the comments. What do you think we're mapping wrong? What invisible dragons are lurking in our modern certainties? Let's find out together.